to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and as always, I'm here with Bill Schofield and John Harrigan. Hey guys, how's it going?
Yo.
Hey, good to be here.
Doing good.
Always great to be with you guys. And listeners, we've got a good one for you today. We want to talk about Deuteronomy. And just as a quick review, on our last episode on the book of Numbers, we spent some time looking at a few specific themes, like the theme of manna and the snake on the pole and the wilderness wanderings, but we spent a lot of time talking about typology. And so if you haven't listened to that episode, definitely that's one you're not going to want to miss in terms of how typology is understood and played out in the writings of the apostles and in Second Temple literature, taking the themes from the book of Numbers. So we spent some time talking about that, but today we want to talk about Deuteronomy. And I think there's a lot of general unfamiliarity about the book of Deuteronomy, regarding the book of Deuteronomy. When we think of the book of Exodus, maybe people go, oh yeah, we know about the plagues and Mount Sinai and the burning bush and events that are common in the book of Exodus. Typically, when people think of Leviticus, maybe you might think, oh, it's just a bunch of rules about sacrifices and, killing of animals and all that kind of stuff. But then Deuteronomy, at least my experience here in dealing with young people in Texas, is Deuteronomy is, it's just a bunch of laws and a bunch of random things. And maybe there's some cool verses in there that Jesus quotes or whatever, but maybe there's not really any meaning for me in the book of Deuteronomy. And so the average believer, I think of my own life growing up, I didn't really touch Deuteronomy, didn't even think about Deuteronomy. But this week, we want to take a little time and give an overview of the book of Deuteronomy and looking at some of the major themes, how they're understood by the Jewish people. And in particular, we want to familiarize you with the reality of Deuteronomy, not just the ideas and not just a few of the events and the stories, but how Deuteronomy eventually will develop what we would call apocalyptic eschatology and becoming a seedbed for that.
Yeah, so unlike other books where we kind of presume people have a knowledge of the book, this week we're going to kind of walk through Deuteronomy and talk about it a little bit just to give more familiarity with it, particularly the major ideas that are happening within and how those ideas kind of become the seedbed that is projected forward in Jewish tradition, in the prophetic literature, and then ultimately in the apocalyptic literature and expectations, and that those ideas remain consistent throughout. They don't change, and they're presumed in the New Testament when we read. And so the book, the name of the book in Hebrew is the Devarim, which is meaning the words. And it comes from chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel, which is different from the Septuagint, which the name in the Septuagint is Deuteronomion, meaning second law. But basically, it's the words of Moses to the new generation after the desert wanderings, after 40 years, and those of fighting age have died off. And so it's a recounting by Moses of the end of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So it's kind of a condensed form of those three books together that is rehashing for the new generation that this covenant is still in effect and applies to you. So it really kind of revolves around the covenant, the law that's given, and the future of that generation, that God has chosen them to keep these commands and statutes so that they may live long in the land going forward.
Yeah, so if we were to start off just as far as an overview, the first few chapters will highlight, partly in the text and partly just in the logic of it, will highlight a lot of the function and the reason behind Deuteronomy. And I think the significance of Deuteronomy is going to be highlighted a lot here, because what you have is, like John said, it's kind of a rehearsal of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and those events, for a new generation. But it's not just that they hadn't heard them before, because it actually reframes history. It actually reframes a lot of the Exodus and Numbers stories in a way that they're not framed in Exodus and Numbers. Doesn't mean it's adding or changing the story, but it frames it in such a way so that they would look backwards and interpret history in a particular way, because it motivates them moving forward. And so what's interesting about this, and we'll talk about this in the next week or two related to Deuteronomy, but what's interesting is that this pattern is significant in that it actually becomes kind of the prophetic prototype of how you frame the oracles to Israel. And you can see this all the way up into the New Testament with Jesus, and in Acts 7 with the martyrdom of Stephen, and later with Paul, that it becomes common in the prophetic tradition at some point that in order, the way that you present the oracles of God is you first remind the nation of their history. And you frame their history in a particular way so that they'll understand the oracles. And really, this is the first time we see this happening, is with Deuteronomy. Framing history in such a way so that the oracles in the latter part of the book will make sense to them. And so part of the significance is introduced right at the beginning, because it gives a brief historical review of some of the events from Exodus through Numbers.
Yeah. Another really important concept that I think is introduced right at the beginning here of Deuteronomy. This is in Deuteronomy 1. And this is really significant because I think Deuteronomy, because of the way that it's typically understood as this idea of like, oh, it's just a bunch of laws and God gives Israel a bunch of things to do. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but man, it's just so hard. And as if the point of it all was just to say, well, good luck. You can't really do it. And you got to look forward to Jesus or something. I mean, this is right at the beginning of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 30 and 31, it says, "The Lord your God who goes before you is the one who will fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes. And in the wilderness where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as one carries a child, all the way that you've traveled until you reach this place." The way that this is expressed is not some kind of legalistic just handling of the way that God gave instructions, say, okay, well, we just have to do these things. And, then, this is presented as an expression of divine grace, that God is framing Israel's deliverance from the wilderness and from the nations by which he brought them out of, and is bringing them into the promised land as an expression of his kindness and of his grace towards them. And this is the point of the whole book, not in some kind of legalistic observance and the way that maybe later Christian tradition would frame how Deuteronomy is typically understood, or how the law maybe generally is typically understood. Because really this idea of law versus grace is just an anachronistic dichotomy, a dichotomy that was generated later in history. But right from the beginning here, Israel's deliverance and God's dealings with them is framed as an expression of his grace and of his benevolence and of his kindness and generosity toward them. And that's really how we should see Deuteronomy and really the whole thrust of the law and Israel's history being framed as an expression of divine grace.
Yeah, and we'll see this analogy of father and son that'll play out a number of times in the book of Deuteronomy. So a lot of times Deuteronomy is kind of seen as the deliverance of a rule book to the nation. And it's like, there are rules, and the statutes and commands and rules are very much front and center, but the overall spirit of it is more like we give rules to our kids because we want them to become functioning human beings that get along in society. We want them to grow and be able to have positive relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And so the same kind of feel permeates the book of Deuteronomy that is really, it's summarized after, the first three chapters kind of rehearses up through Numbers. Then you get chapter 4, and chapter 4 is really a summary of the whole book, in which you get God is making this covenant and giving this law that they may walk it out in the land, and it gets projected forward into the future, and that God wants them. So, for example, chapter 4, the first verse, it says, "And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and rules that I'm teaching you, and do them, that you may live and go in and take possession of the land the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you." And so the heart behind the whole book is really for their well-being and life, and that's why the rules are being given.
Yeah, John, that's good. The other thing that I think of when I read through Deuteronomy is that the laws are even more land-centered and specifically Jerusalem-centered than they are in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Well, Leviticus has, that's very Jerusalem-centered because of the covenant or because of the temple, but it's very organized around assuming that they're functioning this way in the land. And so, number one, they're functioning as a sovereign people, so that they're going to be able to structure society around these things. I mean, like take for instance, for instance, you have the awkwardness of the Sabbath. And when you get to the conversation in Paul, the conversation around Sabbath, there's so much confusion, not in Israel. In Israel, there's no issue keeping the Sabbath, Jew or Gentile, not an issue. Because it's the law of the land. It's how people function there.
Right.
But it's out in the diaspora where people are trying to figure out how the heck you interact with the Roman world when your employer, most employers wouldn't have ever heard of a week, much less a 7-day week.
Right.
And so the awkwardness of functioning outside of, being a sovereign people is evidence, when they're not in the land. And Deuteronomy really does assume how things are going to function in an ideal sense when they're in the land and they're walking in God's ways. So that's a big point, because sometimes, like Josh mentioned, that kind of legalistic interpretation simply fails to acknowledge simple things like that.
Yeah.
If you acknowledge that it's just this is how you'll function when you're living in the land, a lot of that actually falls into place as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these three points that get emphasized over and over, the covenant, the law, and the land, they end up becoming kind of the seedbed that prophetic tradition pushes it forward, right? It begins to get pushed forward in Deuteronomy. But the prophetic tradition afterwards really takes these three realities and begins building on them in an increasingly apocalyptic way, that then the apocalyptic tradition after that and the apocalyptic literature presumes upon these three realities. The irony is that these three realities, when it's taken out of the Jewish context, end up getting extracted out of a vision of the future. And so even when there is, even when it is not like an overt, like Greek immaterial heavenly destiny reality, there's you still, if there is the day of the Lord and the resurrection of the dead and the judgment, but the three central realities around which those apocalyptic events were presumed by Jews in the first century in Second Temple Judaism, the three central realities are what are given in Deuteronomy, which is the covenant, the law, and the land. And that is the context around which the greater prophetic and apocalyptic tradition develop upon those three things. But those are just taken for granted throughout. But if you don't have, if Deuteronomy isn't the starting point for the development of the vision of the future, then you kind of lose the main realities that are presumed by everybody.
Yeah, great, because it's not like covenant, law, and land are not discussed, prior to this in the Torah. But really, the way that Deuteronomy talks about covenant, law, and land is the way that gets kind of picked up on in later prophetic tradition and apocalyptic writers. So it's very, very, very important.
Really is a section right here at the end of chapter 4 that plays this out or begins to project this forward into the future. I think it'd be just really cool to read these verses real quick. It's Deuteronomy 4, verse 25. When you father children and children's children, you've grown old in the land. If you act corruptly by making carved image and doing what's evil in the sight of the Lord and provoking him, he says, I'm going to call heaven and earth to witness against you. You're going to utterly perish from the land. It's exile, the idea. And then the Lord, verse 27, will scatter you among the peoples. You're going to be left few in number, and you're going to serve other gods. But from there, verse 29, you will seek the Lord your God. So the idea of return, you will find him if you search after him with all your heart and all your soul. And then verse 30, when you are in tribulation or distress, and all of these things come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. And this is Deuteronomy 4's, right at the beginning of the book, Deuteronomy 4's way of beginning to project this into the future, which then, as you said, gets picked up in the prophetic tradition, gets picked up by the apostles and Jesus throughout Second Temple literature, that forms the seedbed for apocalyptic eschatology.
Yeah, because we take it for granted now.
Right.
I mean, that's just assumed by every prophecy teacher, every, commentary on, Matthew 24.
Right.
But this is really where it comes from.
Right. I mean, when Jesus is talking about the Great Tribulation, did he just pull that out of thin air? No, he's talking about Deuteronomy. He's talking about Deuteronomy 4:30. Very
good point. Yeah, that's great. And so the next section, next kind of significant division would be the Decalogue. So the Decalogue, again, reintroduced. And some of the details in the Decalogue are framed differently, even in a way that would basically be picked up elsewhere later on as well. So in chapter 4 you have kind of the framing of the Decalogue, and it starts off. Then the Lord, and starting in verse 12, then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice, and he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is the 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. The Lord commanded me at that time to teach you the statutes and rules, that you might do them in the land that you are going in to possess. So again, it's very land-centered here in Deuteronomy. And there's some added nuances that later on get picked up on. Like, for example, in what you have in Exodus is the reason behind the Sabbath in Exodus is that God made the heavens and the earth, and then he rested. And so we should rest. And here, specifically, it has to do with a reflection on God is the one who delivered from Egypt.
Yeah.
That's why you should celebrate Shabbat. So in Deuteronomy 5:15, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. So that I think I don't have it open in front of me, but I also think in the final command, you also have the added command that you don't just covet. It's not just that you don't covet your neighbor's house, you also don't covet your neighbor's wife, which then becomes a paradigm later for, like, Jesus' words about lusting. It's not, you don't covet your neighbor's wife. It's just a Torah idea. So the Decalogue kind of gets mobilized and reframed a little bit according to the kind of the direction where Deuteronomy is taking things.
Yeah, so in chapter 6, you have kind of the transition into the well-known, the Shema, and the exhortation that Moses gives around the 10 Commandments and the laws and statutes that are given in context to that, which most people are familiar with. So in chapter 4, it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your might. These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. Bind them on your hand, put them on your as frontlets for your eyes, write them on your doorposts, etc., etc. And so you really have, the emphasis by Moses of these realities need to be written on the heart. And this is an emphasis that you get throughout the book of Deuteronomy. I think 30 times, over 30 times, references to these laws and statutes being written on the heart. And the circumcision of the heart in chapter 10, and then later on in chapter 30, you have a real emphasis on the inward reality, which is kind of goes against the common perception that Deuteronomy is just a book of rules, kind of an embodiment of a legalistic religion with an outward form, et cetera, and that's just not the reality of what's happening.
Right. I mean, where Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, we always make the point, oh yeah, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this is a heart reality. Well, the Torah makes it a heart reality. It's not that Jesus is innovating it and saying, well, in the past it was just this legalistic observance and whatever, and now it's really about the heart. No, the point you're making, John, is from the beginning, Deuteronomy makes it about the heart.
Yeah, no doubt that there may be some legalistic Jews at the time, particularly within the Pharisaical movement, and it's an outward religion. That's what Jesus is railing against as far as hypocrisy, pride, and pretense. But the way we read Deuteronomy means that we view Jesus as either a revivalist or we view him as a revolutionary. And so if Deuteronomy is pushing for an inward heart reality as the expression of divine grace for his children, then Jesus is pressing for a revivalist reality in contrast to what's happening in Judaism at the time, rather than what's happening in Judaism at the time is an expression of Deuteronomy, and Jesus is revolutionizing it, which the latter is kind of the dominant idea throughout Christian theological tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, moving on to chapter 7, I think chapter 7 is really significant in terms of how it highlights Israel's election and the point of Israel's chosenness as to why God chose them, why he set his love on them. This is just chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. It says, "You are a people holy or set apart to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all of the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any of the other people that the Lord has set his love on you and chose you. You were the fewest of all peoples, but it's because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery and from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." And just again, an emphasis on the fact that Israel has been chosen or elected for the sake of fulfilling the covenantal promises that he made to Abraham, which is to be a blessing to them, and then ultimately that they can be a blessing to the rest of the nations, right? So the oath and the covenant that he swore, this is why God has chosen them and set them apart. And I think that, again, in the Christian theological tradition, we go, oh, well, God has a people, and that people was Israel, but now it's the church. And, this gets played out and confused in many ways, like we've talked about in the past. But here, I think the significance of why God chose Israel and how this is an enduring chosenness, an enduring election, even when the New Testament uses this phrase, election or chosenness, rather than some sort of later Calvinistic tradition, the New Testament just presumes what exists already in Deuteronomy, which is chosenness for a role, for a purpose, for the sake of blessing the nations as God swore to Abraham. So yeah, that's pretty significant here in chapter 7.
That's good. And then the next few chapters, so chapters 8 through 11, basically reflect a little bit on the wanderings, and again, kind of in keeping with the role of Deuteronomy to frame the history of Israel from the Exodus onward. For the people, it basically like chapter 8 is where he really starts to be really intentional with like, think about it, guys. Think about how history went.
Yeah.
Think about it. What does it mean? What is it saying moving forward? And so you have chapter 8 and chapter 9 are familiar, at least little passages in there because of Jesus using little statements in these chapters in the wilderness period. When he was that, the 40 days fasting in the wilderness. And so, but you have like in chapter 8, starting in verse 2, you have, you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And interestingly, that gets kind of played forward. So here the Lord is evaluating what's in their heart, if they're going to be a people that are prone to obey or not. And by the time you get later on, and we'll talk about in the farewell and the commissioning of Joshua, the Lord says to Moses and Joshua, he goes, I already know that the purpose they have in their heart. But anyways, going on in chapter 8, and he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God was disciplining you. So basically, as a reflection, he just highlights, like, guys, you almost starved to death, but at the same time, your clothing wasn't wearing out and your foot did not swell these 40 years. And so I want you to look back and reflect that you weren't hungry because I lacked the power to provide for you. I was actually working in you to try to prove a point and to try to demonstrate something, so you would realize that you are not prepared to obey for the long haul at this point. And so basically so that they would just receive his instruction and take their life more seriously, right? But he's kind of giving him this reflection. This is as a man disciplines his son, that I'm trying to train you in obedience.
Yeah, and there's so many themes here that Jesus picks up during his 40 days of fasting that so commonly they just get interpreted as, see, Jesus is fulfilling Israel's history and kind of invalidating all that, when in reality, it's Jesus identifying with that history and these ideas that are in Deuteronomy, he's reinforcing and confirming as Israel's Messiah, as they're being projected to their ultimate end, and that this is what he is giving himself to, trusting God to bring about, because that's what the temptations are in the wilderness. If you are the Son of God, if you are the Messiah that is going to do all of this that's laid out in the prophetic literature, then change, the rocks to bread. And so he quotes, Deuteronomy 8 here. And the point is not that somehow he's fulfilling it. He's saying the same way that God was saying in Deuteronomy 8 to those people, trust in God to bring you through. Jesus is saying to Satan, I trust in God to anoint me on the day of God, Psalm 110, Psalm 2. He's going to say, he's going to say to me, you are my son. On this day, I have become your father. And he's going to anoint me to judge the living and the dead, etc. Yeah. And so it's not my power or my ability, which then he goes on in chapter 8, right? After you've come into the land, he who fed you in the wilderness, verse 16 in chapter 8, with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you, to do you good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You should remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power and to get wealth, etc. And so the same idea that God is pushing in Deuteronomy 8 is the same idea that Jesus is extracting. He's just extracting it in its ultimate apocalyptic context. But both of them are assuming the same realities of the covenant and God's choosing of this people, his faithfulness to them, the reason he gave them the law, and the future that God has in plan for them.
Right. That's a great point. Yeah, Matthew seems particularly concerned. I know we're getting off track, but Matthew seems really particularly concerned with identifying Jesus with Israel. That Jesus was particularly concerned with his identification with Israel. And I think, like you were just saying, John, that so the Lord here, or Moses here is saying the Lord treated you the way he did so that you would learn that man really is only going to live by the promises of God, by the things that have come from his mouth. And so that's Jesus' response to being tempted. He says, I'm learning the lessons of Israel in the wilderness.
And that's the thing that gets anointed with power.
Yeah.
Right. The irony is that Gentiles take it and they do the exact opposite of what is meant.
I learned that the lesson in the wilderness is nonsense, and I've moved on from it.
And the power of the Holy Spirit fulfills all that and negates it all, so it doesn't all really matter anyway.
That's right.
And now we've ushered in the new era.
Makes lots of sense. Chapter 9, do not say in your heart after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it's because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess the land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or your uprightness of your heart are you going to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving out. And that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Another big theme. What I'm doing is not because you guys are hot stuff. It's because of the wickedness of the nations around you, and it's because I love the fathers.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and I think these themes also get picked up in Paul quite a bit around the issues of righteousness in light of the coming judgment, and that, Paul is pointing back, the gifts and promises are irrevocable. God has always functioned this way, Romans 4, and that it's not by your own righteousness that you're delivered from slavery. It's not by your own righteousness that you're delivered from the wrath to come.
Yep. That's good, guys. Well, in our next section that we could probably chunk up Deuteronomy into, it's probably the larger section here of this book. Maybe you could say chapters 12 all the way through 26. And maybe when most people think of Deuteronomy, this is the section they think of, because there's all sorts of instructions and laws for how the society is supposed to function, how Israel as a nation is supposed to be loyal to and honor God and worship God, how leadership is supposed to function within Israel. God is setting Israel's culture and setting a foundation for how they ought to live as they're in the land. And this is really what this whole section of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 26, is about.
Yeah, that's good. And because it does, like John mentioned above, the various themes, it does really emphasize life in the land versus life in exile, right? Life in the land, that's how you walk according to the Torah in Deuteronomy. It assumes that you're going to be living in the land.
Yeah.
And a lot of the themes here are really, they're to be understood that way. They're not religious. They're not religious laws. They're actually like the laws of the land. They're legal code. And like one example is, I think you think of the king in chapter 17, or the prophet in chapter 18. And these are folks in the ancient world who carried a heck of a lot of influence and power. And prophets were feared not only in Israel, but elsewhere. Like we have, Balaam, is a good example from the Torah in Numbers 22, 24, 3 and 24. But you also have like the king and the prophet, their influence, so it's their power is generally taken for granted in most cultures. And the only real commentary that the law has on these guys is to limit their influence. Like the king, the only real laws that apply to the king are that his influence ought to be limited and it be less, you have a corrupt king and you threaten the entire culture with corruption. And likewise with the prophet, is you have a prophet that could come along, and because he shows a little oracle, everybody fears him and does everything he says. And he says, no, we cannot do that. We have to fear God only, and we have to take his law more seriously than that. And so there a lot of the book of the book really is going to be comprised of a lot of laws for society that, they also involve, some of the protocols for worship and how the leadership ought to function. But generally, the laws for society are predominant, and it assumes living in the land and having, their own sovereignty.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that comes out of, on a bigger picture is that Deuteronomy creates this idea within the land that the law rules, that God rules through the law, which is no small idea. We kind of take it for granted because a lot of Western legal code is based off of Deuteronomic ideas and Sinaitic ideas, but in a lot of the world, it's just not. For example, I live in an area where the law is pretty flexible, and it comes down to the will of one guy. And if you defy that one guy, you disappear. There's like 50,000 people. They just disappear, right. And nobody knows. They're in some prison rotting or whatever. And if you want to get around the law, you can usually get around it some way. And so I have conversations with people. I've had a number of conversations with Egyptians where they just look at me and they're like, well, you don't understand. You live in a land under the rule of law. We don't live in that. There's laws, but it's not a land under the rule of law. And so that's really when you have that kind of the ancient world where the king functions with absolute power, with the prophets and the magicians around him, in light of he's anointed by the gods. Everything revolves around that person and their will, and the expression of the laws in context to that, rather than what's happening in Deuteronomy is that you have a law that's given for high and low alike. And I really appreciate chapter 17 where it's talking about, the king, when you do go into the land and you get a king, and it says, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and his statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right or to the left, so that he may continue long in the kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So I think you have a leveling of the playing field, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, we have to remember in this whole section of legal code, instructions on how God is setting Israel apart from the other nations, making them different and distinct, laws for worship, leadership, these kinds of things, that this is, once again, God's grace to them as a people. This is him setting them apart, making them different and distinct from the rest of the nations so that they can be the people through which the rest of the nations will be blessed, that they're holy, they're distinct, right? And it's not just as we've developed often, as we've talked about before, and as we mentioned earlier in the episode, this isn't just some kind of weighty, like, well, I'm just going to give you something to do, Israel, just to show you that you can't actually keep it or something like that, in terms of the way that this is often thought of. But once again, the point is so that they can live in the land and they can be the people that God has called them to be. This is just a gracious expression of God's kindness to them.
Right. So the problem that we have looking back at law is that we have a hard time looking at it as a legal code or the law of the land. We see it like Luther. Luther saw it through the prism of a religion. So everything gets colored because the way Luther read Paul is Judaism is a religion.
Right.
And the commands are the people's way of trying to reach God. And that's just not what's going on.
Right.
I don't think it's legalistic that there's a speed limit. I don't think it's legalistic. I don't think anybody's trying to earn their salvation because they're supposed to not cheat on their taxes, And so the things are just framed so differently in Luther because by his day, the Jewish people had been displaced from the land of Israel for several centuries in the Middle Ages. And so at that point, Judaism is essentially a religion because they'd basically been caught up in the culture of other religions now, like kind of Christianized Rome kind of really came to define religion. And then so other groups are starting to be viewed as a religion. And of course, Judaism was because they were displaced and hardly even an organized people group. And so Luther sees them as a religion, and he basically treats the scriptures and the commands, the law as a whole, even as some sort of legalistic, religious way of trying to approach God, and that's just not what it was.
Right. So then, basically, the book of Deuteronomy becomes a giant example of God gave this whole thing to prove to them that they can't keep it, so that he can make a huge lesson later on about justification by faith, which is really bizarre. Yeah. I mean, like, if you think about the whole idea of it's just a massive misuse of time and people and ideas.
Well, if it's right, if the projection of Deuteronomy is right, and it involved like the curses and enemy oppression and their children dying and people taking over their land, starvation, exile. Like we're talking about God. This is not a book, the fables. We're talking about, if that's true, then God literally sacrifices millions of Jewish lives just to teach Christians that they can't follow the law.
Seems like a better way. It seems like there's a better way to teach human depravity. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe it's just me.
I mean, but that whole point is totally rejected in Deuteronomy 30 anyways, right?
Uh-oh.
I mean, Romans 10, Paul quotes that and talks and relates this whole idea in Romans 10. It's just crazy to think this way.
Yeah. Why don't you just read that real quick, Josh? Even if we don't go into Romans 10.
Yeah, so this is classic Deuteronomy 30, and the statement, again, that we're making is, man, the law is just too hard, and God is using this whole example throughout Israel's history to prove to Christians 2,000 years later, oh, man, the law is just too hard, and I guess, man, I'm so thankful for a Savior that came to release me from the law. Well, Deuteronomy 30, starting in verse 11, this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you. Neither is it far off. It's not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven and bring it to us and bring it near to us, or do we hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you can do it.
Ouch.
I don't know how much more explicit you can get from the words of Deuteronomy itself, saying that the Torah, the law, is not too hard.
And if those sound familiar, it's from Romans 10.
Right.
And if it sounds like Romans 10 is saying the opposite of what Josh just read, then there's a good chance you've misunderstood Romans 10.
Right.
Right. So some of the we'll get in more later on Paul's rhetoric and what he's fighting against, which is something different as far as the conversion of the Gentiles, the forced conversion of the Gentiles. And so his rhetoric against Torah observance for Gentiles is often projected back as a broad interpretive model onto the Tanakh, which is that's where the train wreck happens. So that's this idea that the book of Deuteronomy is given to prove that we can't keep the law is not, I mean, the whole of the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus saying, keep the law in truth, do Deuteronomy as it's said to do, don't walk out in hypocrisy and pretense. But we'll maybe in question and answer, we'll kind of talk a little bit more about Paul's rhetoric and how that plays out.
Yeah, John. Well, I think if we could move on to our next section of Deuteronomy here in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, we would see the blessings and the curses, specifically in Deuteronomy 28, Mount Ebal in Deuteronomy 27. And these become massively significant in terms of how they're pressed forward eschatologically. But definitely, it's not like, even we've said in the past, it's not like these don't have meaning for the people. Again, this is as they enter the land, and if they perform and walk out the commands that God has given them, there's blessings and curses. This is common in the ancient Near East, of blessings and curses having to do with a covenant. But I think representative of these blessings and curses, you could say Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 and 2, if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God who set you high above all the nations of the earth. And these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. And then dropping down to verse 15 of Deuteronomy 28, if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And then dropping down even to verse 64, this is kind of a big theme that is seen throughout the prophetic literature and, of course, into the New Testament and projected forward. It's the theme of exile. And the Lord will scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which you nor your fathers have known. Of course, this is picked up in the prophetic material, like I think of Daniel 9 and Daniel's prayer, and Daniel relating back to when he's thinking, okay, I'm in Babylon, our people are in exile. Why is this the case? Well, he reflects back on the curses in Deuteronomy 28, and he says in Daniel 9, verse 13, as it is written in the law of Moses, all this calamity has come upon us. Yet we haven't entreated the favor by turning for our iniquities and gaining insight by your truth. So this is crazy, right? This is played forward in terms of the prophetic literature and into the New Testament, but these blessings and curses are just a massive part of this section of Deuteronomy.
Yeah, next week we'll spend a lot more time just kind of talking out the future of this covenant and law and the breaking of it and the coming restoration and the final blessing and how that plays out in apocalyptic literature and kind of its ultimate conclusion. So
yeah, that's really kind of how the book is going to end. There's a few more divisions that we could make in the book, but really you have, following the curses and the blessings, you have what's sometimes called the covenant renewal. I don't know if that's inaccurate. That's, it's just in your titles there. But so in these chapters, you kind of have a projecting forward of what it might look like with, life with, these blessings and curses on the table now. And like, for example, in chapters 27, 28, you get this sense of the blessings and the curses. They're a possibility, like they're on the table, and who knows? But after that, you have things expressed with more certainty. We'll have, later on in Joshua in a second too, but even before we get to the conversation with Joshua, like chapter 30 begins, when all these things have happened to you, the blessing and the cursing and the curses that I've set before you, and if you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you. So the idea is that I gave them to you so that once they come upon you, if you'll reflect on what I said, you'll realize they came because of your disobedience. And so that's one thing to say. But so it's kind of like they're a possibility, and now they're actually, once they've all happened, then the reflection on those things is actually going to cause you to return to me. And then in verse 4, again, still in chapter 30, even if you are exiled to the end of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. And the Lord will bring you back into the land. And in verse 6, it says, moreover, the Lord will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, which is, of course, a theme that gets picked up in Jeremiah with the conversation of the new covenant. And it is important to note a distinction. It's not just the theme of having a circumcised heart. The theme is, like John quoted before, chapter 10, verse 16, you circumcise your heart, guys. You remove the things that the obstacles that keep you from obedience. I'm giving you that charge. And then, but again, here, there's some sort of moment in the future where it anticipates God actually doing this work in them of removing the obstacles to their obedience. And we'll talk more about this next week as well.
Yeah, Bill, and the same idea kind of plays forward again in the next chapter, in chapter 31, where Joshua is commissioned. And, what started out as something on the table and then seems more certain is kind of taken for granted in chapter 31. And verse 16, it says, the Lord said to Moses, soon you'll lie down with your ancestors. Then this people will begin to prostitute themselves to the foreign gods in their midst, the gods of the land in which they're going. They'll forsake me, breaking my covenant that I've made with them. So it's pretty much an inevitability at this point going forward that this is how it's going to play out. Then later on in the prophetic and apocalyptic traditions, the curses that come upon the people on the land because of the breaking of the covenant are kind of a surety that this will play out to the end of the age before the final restoration happens.
Yeah.
And so then that really brings us to the final section. Now, so the book really ends with the account of the death of Moses, which you may have guessed it, Moses didn't write about. And also the final blessing section, which we could say more about the final blessing, but we're just kind of, bringing up the different sections right now. But you also have chapter 32 in the Song of Moses. And the Song of Moses kind of is introduced in chapter 31. It's a part of the conversation that John was just reading about. And, because I know that, you'll lie down with your ancestors and they're going to forsake me and break the covenant. And he says down in verse 21, and when many terrible troubles come upon them, this song will confront them as a witness, because it will not be lost from the mouth of their descendants. For I know what they are inclined to do even now, before I have brought them into the land that I promised them. That very day, Moses wrote this song and taught it to the Israelites. And so what's interesting is the Song of Moses basically gets framed as a song that is not even relevant in their day, but they had to memorize it in light of anticipating these scenarios coming in the future. And so it's essentially, and it's almost like what I described Deuteronomy as at the beginning, like a retelling and a reframing of their history and then a projecting forward. That's what the Song of Moses is, all in one chapter. So it reframes their history and then it frames it future oriented in terms of everything from the cyclical restorations to a cataclysmic end, and even hints at the resurrection at the end of the Song of Moses. It's pretty powerful.
Really
in the past, when people have asked me to help understand the Bible, my standard answer has been for years, If you want to understand the apostles, you got to understand Jesus. So, because that's what Christianity is, right? It's all based on the writings of Paul, generally. But if you want to understand Paul, you got to understand Jesus. But if you want to understand Jesus, you got to understand the prophets. And you ain't going to understand the prophets without the book of Deuteronomy. And if you want to get the book of Deuteronomy, focus on chapter 32 first, and then go from there.
It's really good.
Yeah, that's good. And I think, another point on kind of the divine foreknowledge that comes into play at the end of the book of Deuteronomy is that it's not divine foreknowledge to prove a theological propositional point. It's divine foreknowledge so that there can be a restoration of the covenant after the breaking of it. So the whole point of divine foreknowledge is to reinforce the covenant that's being made with this people in light of their future.
Yeah, guys, great thoughts. Well, listeners, that will kind of wrap up just our quick overview, or maybe not so quick overview of Deuteronomy today. There's so much more to talk about next week. We want to actually look at the covenant. We want to talk about, again, the theme of election, why God chose this people, and we want to talk about the law, and more specifically on how these ideas, the covenant, Jewish election, the law, how these things become the mechanisms by which then history is driven forward and played out eschatologically. And as we've talked about even a little bit in this episode, these themes in Deuteronomy become the seedbed and the foundation for what we would call later the Second Temple literature and the New Testament would lay out as apocalyptic eschatology. And, I think you made this point earlier, John, that apocalyptic eschatology isn't based on theological suppositions. It's built on the covenant and this set of instructions given to this specific people. And God, again, has set them apart, made them distinct from the rest of the nations through these sets of instructions for the sake of bringing the promises to Abraham to pass so that they can be a blessing to the rest of the nations. And this is how it's going to be pushed forward and played out. The theme is not being redefined or reimagined or reinterpreted by Jesus and the apostles, but rather affirmed and reinforced by Jesus and the apostles. So John and Bill, great to be with you guys this week. Listeners, we hope this has been edifying and encouraging, and you're able to even open up Deuteronomy and read it now with a little bit more clarity and understanding rather than just being a set of random laws that are just too hard to keep, and praise God that Jesus fulfilled all that. Hopefully you see it a little differently now. But join us next time, and we will speak to you again then. Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless, and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.